Welcome to this online lesson looking at helping the wounded in World War I. This is part 3 of 3 where we'll be exploring the sources. This will require you to apply knowledge that you've gained from other parts of the course in order to succeed. So if you've not looked at my earlier videos, or if you haven't got existing knowledge of this topic, I'd urge you to do that first. Because the aims are to identify links between sources, to analyse the link between sources and topics and inquiries, which will require you to have some knowledge of how this was done, and to evaluate the utility and usefulness of sources, which is just a useful skill to have. Have a look at this diagram. If you looked at the previous videos, you might recognise it from part 1 of Helping the Wounded. It shows the evacuation route in World War I. Only I've removed the labels. Here's your do now task, a memory test, so please don't use your notes for this. Study the diagram. Can you accurately remember and name each stage of the evacuation route? You might remember if you did lesson 1, or rather part 1 on Helping the Wounded, that we came up with some mnemonics or rhymes to help us remember this. Perhaps that can help you to remember it now. So what I'd like you to do is write out the stages of the evacuation route in the correct order. The pictures are there to help you. As an extension, if someone had a light wound without the complications of infection, at which stage would they most likely be returned to their unit on the front line? Be specific and explain your answer. Okay, pause the video here, have a go at that do now task, and then press play when you're ready to continue. Done? Well, let's see what you can remember. Stage 1 of the evacuation route was the stretcher bearers. Stage 2 was the regimental aid post, possibly a dressing station as well, but I'm going to simplify it to this for the time being. Here the soldiers would be patched up, ready to be moved on the field ambulance. Remember, the field ambulance was the organisation, not the vehicle. They would then be taken to a casualty clearing station where it would be decided whether they could be patched up sufficiently to be moved back to the front line, or whether they just simply needed their condition stabilised so that they could be safely moved on a hospital train to a base hospital. So, how did you remember it? Well, one of our acronyms was BRASH, to remember this. BRASH standing for Stretcher Bearers, the Regimental Aid Post, and then the ambulance, or field ambulance, then the casualty clearing station, and then the H in BRASH being either hospital train or base hospital. So that might help you. If not, come up with your own to try and remember it. Let's move on. We're going to do some detailed working with the sources now, and this will involve an element of an exam practice as well. The exam practice will be focused on the Edexcel exam board, but might be useful if you're doing other exam boards as well. In previous lessons, we've studied in some detail the way that the evacuation route was organised and staffed. We're now going to study one source about how much work they had to do. So have a look at source C here. It is possible that in the exam they could give you a source of statistics to interpret. I've seen this in various specifications and textbooks, although I do think it's fairly unlikely that they'll do this because there's such a strong numeracy element to it rather than a purely historical one. But it is possible they will, so let's give it some practice. This particular source shows the number of casualties who passed through the dressing station at Houge Chateau, which was near Ypres, in August of 1917. The statistics were recorded by staff working there. Firstly, on which day was the busiest for this field ambulance? B, what might explain why it was so busy at this time? Now, you should be able to relate this answer to one of the key events that we looked at in lesson 3 in this playlist. If you're unfamiliar with the most important battles of the First World War that we focus on as part of this topic, it would be well worth your while looking back and looking at that first. But you might be able to make a bit of an assessment based upon your own knowledge, even if you haven't done so. Secondly then, what do you think is meant by the terms sitting and lying casualties? And then thirdly, consider our acronym REAL. How useful is this source and others like it for studying the work of the field ambulance? And consider what this was again. Think about the key events. Are these likely to be actually typical? So the acronym REAL stands for relevant. Is the information that you need relevant to the question? In this case, usefulness for studying the field ambulance. Is there enough information within it? Or does it really need to be used in combination with other things? Can you trust the author not to have made mistakes or not to be misleading? Would they have had access to the information? And then lastly, consider the limitations. Do these undermine its usefulness? Okay, enough from me for the time being. Pause the video and answer those 3 questions now. Press play when you're ready to continue. Done? Okay. For question 1A, which was the busiest day for this field ambulance, well, there's a quite clear answer on that. It's the 11th of August 1917. Of lying patients, there are 113 listed, and sitting patients a whopping 841, almost twice the number on the next busiest day. So what might explain why it's so busy at this time? You may have given a generalised answer that shows that on the 11th of the 8th there was a specific attack or offensive. Well, actually there was a specific attack in the Hooge area at that time, which meant that lots of men would have been exposed to enemy fire and would therefore have been wounded. But in a wider sense, the summer of 1917 around Ypres is famous for a particularly devastating battle. The Third Battle of Ypres, better known as Passchendaele. So these statistics come from the Battle of Passchendaele. So it's no wonder some of these statistics are so high. So what is meant by the terms sitting and lying casualties? Well, I wanted to put that in there because I think it's fairly obvious what a sitting casualty would be, but what about lying? Does this mean that there are soldiers who have come in lying about being wounded? Well, no, it doesn't. It means that the lying soldiers are the ones who would be on stretchers unable to move themselves, i.e. probably the most seriously wounded. Sitting casualties would be ones who would be able to sit on a bench or in a chair or on the ground and wait for treatment. These might otherwise be referred to as the walking wounded. In a triage system where they're assessing the order in which patients should be treated, the lying wounded would almost always be seen before the sitting wounded. So how useful is a source like this and others like it for studying the work of the field ambulance? Well, quite useful, but with some limitations as well. It gives us really good statistics for understanding when they were busiest and how many soldiers would come through the system at that time. But on its own, it's limited because it's not quite enough information. You would need other sources and other knowledge in order to understand that this relates to, for example, the Battle of Passchendaele. You would need to check this so that you could see why perhaps there were spikes in the demand on, for example, the 4th of the 8th and on the 11th of the 8th. And on its own, it doesn't provide that information. So maybe it's not enough. The author, though, can be trusted. It was vital that detailed statistics were taken by the medical services like the field ambulance so that they could account for patients and see how many had been returned to service and how many had to be taken to the casualty clearing stations and for further treatment. If they got that wrong, then soldiers could get lost in the system, possibly with fatal consequences. Look how detailed the numbers are as well. They've not been rounded up or rounded down. They are accurate to the individual person as far as we can tell. So considering the limitations, and there are some, it's a fairly useful source, but on its own, maybe not the most. We're now going to explore the sources and apply some of our existing knowledge. We're going to see a series of sources which are labelled from A to H. They are varying usefulness depending on the inquiry that they're being used for. Now remember, all sources are useful if you are using them in the right way. A little bit you wouldn't use a screwdriver to hammer in a nail. And at the same time, you wouldn't use a hammer to hammer in a screw. Both tools are useful, but only when used for the correct purpose. Sources are a bit like that. You've got to use the correct source for the correct inquiry. So your task will be as follows. Which of sources A and H is useful for an inquiry into each of the following topics? When you've selected the appropriate inquiry or inquiries, because there might be more than one that it fits, explain why that source would be useful. There may be more than one source for some topics. The topics that you'll have to apply are the work of the regimental aid posts, the work of the dressing stations, operating theatres and hospitals, the work of the casualty clearing stations, and the transportation of the wounded. The second part will be this. After that, how would you follow up one of the sources to find out more about this topic? Now, this is a specific exam skill that is included in the Edexcel exam, and we'll model how that's done if you're unfamiliar with it later on. It's usually phrased in the following way, though. The detail in a source A that I would follow up would be, and then you choose a detail in the source. Then you choose a question that you could ask to learn a bit more about it. Choose a type of source, as in another source that you could use to follow it up. And then give an answer as to why that type of source might help. So I've introduced the task now. Let's have a look at the sources and start to see which ones can be applied to which inquiries. Let's start with source A. Source A is from the autobiography of Geoffrey Keynes, The Gates of Memory. This was published in 1981. This account was originally published in 1968, though. Keynes was important in developing blood transfusions during World War I. So as we read this source, decide, is this most useful for an inquiry about the role of the regimental aid posts, the work of addressing stations, operating theatres and hospitals, the work of the casualty clearing stations, or the transportation of the wounded? On the 6th of February 1915, I was detailed for duty on an ambulance train. The numbers of patients carried on each journey varied between 100 and 400. During my turn of duty on the train, we carried nearly 19,000 patients. Medical duties were usually restricted to ensuring that the wounded man, who had already been attended in a dressing station, travelled as comfortably as possible with the help of a sedative and pain-killing drugs. Frequently, they had to suffer violent jolts during the shunting operations. Usually, the patients had been fully cared for before being sent on the train by the base hospitals. But on one occasion, on the 12th of March 1915, the train was ordered to go close to the front line and take on casualties who had barely received first aid. Okay, pause the video here, decide which inquiry that one goes mostly with. In this instance, I will give you the answer afterwards because we're just practicing, but in future ones you'll have to do it much more on your own. Done? So hopefully you've identified that that one best goes with the transportation of the wounded. However, it does have some relevance to the work of the casualty clearing stations as well, and the dressing stations, because it shows how the men were patched up before they ended up on the trains. Let's have a look at source B now, a different type of source, in this case a photograph. This photograph shows stretcher bearers leaving casualties at a regimental aid post, sometime during or after 1916. We can tell this from the equipment that the soldiers are wearing, including their helmets. Check out that regimental aid post though. It's hardly a sophisticated building. It doesn't look like it's got a roof. In fact, it doesn't look like it's got all of its walls, but we can see a sign at the back that shows it is indeed a regimental aid post. The soldiers seem to be doing all right though. They seem to be leaning over, possibly exchanging a cigarette. I'm alarmed by the amount of blood on that stretcher in the foreground though. One would wonder whether this is blood from an earlier patient or the one that is lying there. Anyway, enough of that. Decide which inquiry this source best goes with. Pause the video while you make your mind up. I think this one's a little bit more obvious. It goes best with the work of the regimental aid posts, as it shows how basic their facilities were. Okay, so that's demonstrated how this task works. For the next few, you're going to have to do it on your own. I will eventually go through the answers, but not for a while, so make sure you're pausing the video, identifying the relevant inquiry, and then checking the answers afterwards. Do it as independently as possible. Source C, from the diary of E.S.B. Hamilton, dated the 19th of August 1916. Hamilton had been in France for over a year at this time as part of the field ambulance. At the time of this diary entry, he was working at an advanced dressing station on the Somme. The dugout of the advanced dressing station is awfully overcrowded both night and day, and it is impossible to get it cleaned or aired. There were something like 800 people through there in about 30 hours the day before yesterday. This is far too much work for the personnel of 3 officers and about 115 men. The result is a lot of the men are done up and the officers seedy and depressed. Okay, pause the video here. Which inquiry does that best fit with? When you're ready to see source D, press play. Alright, let's have a look at source D. Source D is a photograph of a ward of the casualty clearing station at Hazebrouck near Ypres in 1915. So pause the video again once and make your mind up as to which inquiry this one goes with. Done? Well, here's something I'm just going to point out to you. Notice that the headgear between these soldiers and their uniforms is rather different. This is because some of these soldiers look like French colonial soldiers. If they were wounded in that area, they could still be treated by British facilities if that was all that was nearby. The same would be true actually for German prisoners too. The medical services worked hard to save all soldiers, not just the British. Next, source E. From A Soldier's Journal, 1915 to 1918, by Harvey Cushing, published in 1936. In a future lesson, we're going to look at Harvey Cushing again. He was actually an American brain surgeon, but that's not so relevant here in terms of knowing his background. Let's have a look at what he's describing. Here he's describing the conditions under which he is working during the Battle of Passchendaele on the 19th of August 1917. My prize patient, Baker, with the shrapnel ball removed from his brain, after doing well for 3 days, suddenly shot up a temperature of 104 last night about midnight. I took him to the operating theatre, reopened the perfectly healed external wound, and found to my dismay a massive gas infection of the brain. I bribed 2 orderlies to stay up with him in the operating room, where he could have constant thorough irrigation over the brain and through the track of the missile, passing a warm saline solution through the path taken by the shrapnel to prevent infection. No light except candles was permitted last night. I hope you enjoyed my attempt at an American accent there, but pause the video here and decide which inquiry this source fits. Done? Alright, let's have a look at the next source. Source F. This is a photograph, which looks a lot like a painting, but I believe it's a photograph that's been retouched manually afterwards. So a photograph of the interior of a hospital train carriage constructed by the Caledonian Railway for use in France. Pause the video here, decide on the inquiry, and then when you're ready to look at the next source, press play. Alright, let's move on. Source G is a little bit longer, but we can still apply it to one of our inquiries. From the private scrapbook diary of Violet Gossett, a British nurse who served in base hospitals and casualty clearing stations from 1915 to 1919. Here's an interesting point. It was actually forbidden for a nurse to keep a diary. The following is assembled from handwritten notes made on different days that were then pasted into the scrapbook afterwards. We're lucky as historians that quite a few nurses did this sort of thing. It gives us a real insight. We had a fearful lot of head cases, that means head wounds, about this time as the tin helmets were not in use. Imagine a ward full of men with their brains oozing out of bad head wounds. Stretchers packed like sardines everywhere. They come in lying on stretchers in pools of blood, all soaked through to the skin, also plastered head to foot in mud. 2 colonels died here last night and they cannot get to the men buried. The mortuary was full up. The dead Tommies had been piled up there, just each in a blanket with their bare feet sticking out. I should point out that Tommies is a nickname for the British soldiers. Casualty clearing work was very different to base work. When heavy fighting was on, we were up day and night. Then came a lull and we were able to have some off-duty time. Full of wounded, in an awful state. Went to the colonel and said we would like to see that batch on a train. But he was in a fine old rage and he said we were to obey orders. We heard later that the news had been phoned through that the enemy was rapidly advancing. I really get the sense of the kind of disjointed notes here. You can almost imagine different sections of this being pasted in at different times. But anyway, pause the video while you decide on the relevant inquiry. Let's move on to our last source. Source H. An anaesthetist sedates a patient in a casualty clearing station operating theatre in France, November 1917. Okay, have a look at the source. You may well recognise some of the equipment here from previous lessons, but decide on the inquiry. Done? Well, let's conclude. So, our first task was to identify which of sources A and H is relevant to the different inquiries here. Some of them might be relevant to more than one, but I think these are all the best fits. The source that's most relevant to the work of the RAP, the Regimental Aid Posts, was the photograph of a Regimental Aid Post in source B. The one that was most relevant to the work of a dressing station was source C. The operating theatres and hospital? Well, there's actually 2 here. Sources E and G both give really relevant information for that. The work of the casualty clearing stations is mentioned several times, but best in sources D, G and H. And the transportation of the wounded, the best fit there is source A, that describes the conditions on the trains and how they were used, and source F, that publicity photograph showing how the carriages were laid out. Okay, make any corrections that you need to, and then we'll move on. Exploring the sources further. Choose any source that we've studied in this lesson. How would you follow up one of the sources to find out more about the inquiry that it links to? Think about what questions that you would ask and the types of source that you could use. Now, in the actual exam, if you're doing the Edexcel exam board that is, you would be given a table with the following details already in it. Detailing the source that you would follow up, the question that you would ask, what type of source you could use, and how this might help answer my question. If you've already got some familiarity with approaching these questions, then you can simply pause it here, look back at one of the sources, and see if you can answer the question right away. If you're going to do that, pause the video now. However, if you're unfamiliar with this style of question, let's look at a modelled example first so you can see the idea. We'll have a practice with source F, the photograph of the interior of the hospital train carriage constructed by the Caledonian Railway for use in France. So what question could you ask about source F to learn more about an inquiry into how the wounded were transported in World War I? A 4-mark answer, and you would be given a table like this. Okay, if you want to start doing it now, then you can pause the video, or if you want to see my example first of all before you have a go of your own, then just wait a moment. So here's how I might answer this question, and there's a virtually infinite number of ways that you could actually approach this. The detail in source F that personally I would pick up on is the clean bed sheets. The question I would ask is, were carriages this clean and tidy when in actual service? A source I could use might be a diary by a nurse or an orderly. Remember that one of our sources was actually a diary entry from a nurse, so we know that such things existed. This might help because they might describe what the conditions were like when the carriages were in use. Okay, so that's pretty logical. But one thing to be careful of here is you've got to make your question relevant to the inquiry you're being asked about. In this case, it's an inquiry into how the wounded were transported in World War I. So my question is relevant to that. All right, next we're going to have a look at another practice. Again, I can model this again, but this might be a better opportunity for you to write down an answer of your own. This time, we're going to use source C. What question could you ask about source C to learn more for an inquiry into the work of the dressing stations in World War I? Again, your question should be relevant to this inquiry, the work of the dressing stations. Remember as well that the detail for source F might be something that you actually use as a quote from the source itself, and that's perfectly acceptable. Pause the video now and have a go for yourself. All right, done? You've probably come up with something completely different to me, but see if it follows a similar format to this. If it does, chances are you get 4 marks. A detail that I might pick up on is that 800 patients were seen in 30 hours. The question I would ask, which is relevant to the inquiry of the work of the dressing stations, is how did dressing stations cope with such high casualty rates? A source I could use to follow it up would be official records of dressing station staff, a little bit like that statistical table that we had a look at earlier. Why might this help? Well, records may show if more staff were allocated prior to major attacks. This would be evidence of them preparing for the known number of casualties that they were expecting to get. All right, compare that to your own answer, make any improvements necessary, and then we'll move on. Let's do a final summary against the clock. You're now going to try a quick revision technique. You may not look at your notes for this. I mean, obviously I won't know if you do look at your notes, but just imagine I'll be disappointed. I've included a picture here of a trench watch as worn by World War I officers. Wristwatches became popular in the First World War because they were much more convenient than pocket watches when you were in the filth and mud of the trenches. But anyway, I digress. We're going to use this as something of a timer. Your first task is to describe how the wounded were helped in World War I. I'm going to give you 90 seconds to do this. Okay, there's going to be a timer appearing above the trench watch, and once it fills up the entire trench watch, that will be time up. There's going to be significant levels of silence in this part, so I can let you concentrate, but the time will keep going. So keep an eye on that to get an estimate of how much time you've got left. I will occasionally update you as well. Also, I am actually currently recording this at school. If you hear any voices in the background, well, that happens at schools. They're full of people. So try and cope with that. Anyway, let's move on with task 1. 90 seconds. Describe how the wounded were helped in World War I. Go. "45 seconds remaining. Roughly 20 seconds left. And And that is time. Okay, let's move on to our next timed task. You're going to have less time for this one here. Define what the evacuation route was. Again, try and write for the full 60 seconds with as much detail as possible. Go. That's half time, 30 seconds to go. "15 seconds left. All right, task 3 now. Even less time for this one here. Give an example of the evacuation route. Again, be specific and try and describe what they did. Go. "15 seconds left. Okay, and on to our last one. Sum up how the wounded were helped in no more than 3 words. Decide on your 3 words before you start writing them down and make sure that they're the best 3 words to sum it up that you can have. Okay, 20 seconds for this. Off you go. "10 seconds. 5 seconds. And that's time. It's also time on this lesson as well. If you're working with other people, by all means check your answers with 4 people around you, see if they've put similar things, see if they've put different things. But that's the end of this lesson as far as I'm concerned. You could always put your sum up answers in the comments below, and people will be able to comment on there, and you can compare answers that way. Anyway, I hope this lesson has been useful to you. If it has, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and you'll get more content as well. Thanks very much for watching, and goodbye.